What if the regime in Tehran is now fighting a war it cannot win on two fronts at once? And one of those fronts is a people it has been trying to crush for 47 years. While American and Israeli jets keep hitting Iran night after night, something else is happening along the Western Mountains, something almost nobody outside the region is talking about. Before we go any further, hit that like button right now, because this story is moving fast, and you want to be part of the first wave of people who actually understand it. Subscribe if you're new, and turn on notifications, because what happens next in these mountains could decide how this entire war ends. Let's start with the simple truth. Iran has never been just one country with one people. Inside its western provinces live millions of Kurds, a people with their own language, their own culture, and their own long, painful history with Tehran. For over 40 years, that relationship has mostly meant one thing: control through fear, arrests, executions, villages watched by soldiers, protests crushed before they could grow. And every time the world's attention drifted away, the pressure on Kurdish communities quietly increased again. But in 2026, something shifted. Iran was already shaking from months of protests across the country. People were angry about the economy, angry about repression, angry about a government that seemed to answer every problem with more force. In the middle of all that unrest, Kurdish opposition parties who had spent decades arguing, competing, and sometimes even working against each other did something they had never done before. They sat down together and agreed to stop fighting each other and start coordinating against the one enemy they all shared. On February 22, 2026, in the city of Erbil in northern Iraq, 5 major Kurdish parties signed an agreement to form a joint political and military coalition. It became known as the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. Think about what that actually means. These are groups with different histories, different founders, different ideas about what Kurdish freedom should even look like. Some are older, born in the chaos right after Iran's 1979 revolution. Others are younger, shaped by more recent decades of resistance. Putting them all under one roof was not easy, and it did not happen by accident. It happened because everyone involved understood that this moment, with Tehran already stretched thin, might not come again. Just days after that coalition was formed, the United States and Israel launched a massive air campaign against Iran. Suddenly, the regime was absorbing strikes night after night, hitting missile sites, drone facilities, and command centers across the country. And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. A striking share of those airstrikes landed inside Kurdish provinces. Cities like Kermanshah were hit harder than almost anywhere else in the entire country, second only to the capital. Dozens of security installations belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard were destroyed in Kurdish areas within the first weeks alone. Ask yourself a simple question: who benefits the most when the Revolutionary Guard's grip on Kurdish territory suddenly gets weaker? The people who have been waiting decades for exactly that opportunity, watching from the mountains along the border, are the obvious answer. And Tehran clearly understands this too, because its response has not been subtle. So who exactly makes up this coalition? Let's go through them, because each one brings something different to the table, and understanding them is the key to understanding everything that follows. The first is the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, often shortened to the KDPI. This is the oldest and most established Kurdish opposition movement in Iran, tracing its roots back to before the Islamic Revolution even happened. It has survived assassinations of its leaders, waves of executions, and decades of being hunted by Iranian intelligence. Despite all of that, it never disappeared. Its fighters, often called Peshmerga, a word that literally means those who face death, number in the low thousands. Their goal has always been clear: some form of real self-rule for Kurds inside Iran, whether that comes through a federal system or full independence. In early July 2026, a group of these fighters was ambushed near a village outside Piranshah in West Azerbaijan province. 6 of them were killed. These were not accidental casualties of border patrol. Heavy artillery was used against them, which tells you they were deep into a real operation, not just standing near a fence. The second group is the Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PAK. If the KDPI is the elder of this coalition, PAK is its most aggressive arm. Led by a commander who has pushed hard for direct confrontation, PAK's fighters trained for years alongside international forces during the campaign against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. That matters enormously because it means these are not untested volunteers. These are fighters who already know modern battlefield coordination, who already understand how to move, communicate, and strike using lessons learned in one of the most brutal wars of the last decade. PAK has openly pushed for international attention and support, and it has paid a price for that visibility. In the middle of July 2026, PAK bases were hit by drone strikes on more than one occasion, and several of its fighters were wounded, some critically. PAK then made an explosive accusation. Based on eyewitness accounts and medical examinations of the wounded, they claimed that the weapons used against them contained white phosphorus, a substance capable of causing horrific burns, and they called on international bodies to investigate. Iran has not confirmed this claim, but consider the context. This is a regime that has already been executing protesters during the very same weeks it is under sustained bombing. Nothing about this accusation feels far-fetched, given everything else on the record. The third force is the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK. This is the most politically complicated of the five because it grew out of the same movement as the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which has a long and troubled history with Turkey. That connection makes some regional players uneasy. But militarily, PJAK's fighting wing, often called the Eastern Kurdistan Units, is considered by many analysts to be among the most capable in the entire coalition, and a significant number of its fighters are women. These units have long operated in the Zagros Mountains, some of the harshest and most difficult terrain in the region. According to statements from the coalition, PJAK fighters began entering Iranian territory as early as March 2, 2026, with thousands reportedly moving through the Zagros mountain range. It's important to say clearly that this specific claim about the scale of the deployment has been disputed and is difficult to verify independently. What is confirmed is that clashes between PJAK and Iranian forces have been documented near several towns through the spring and summer, and that PJAK fighters have died in these confrontations. The fourth group is Kabat, the Organization of Iranian Kurdistan Struggle. It is smaller than the others, but its presence in the coalition matters because it broadens the political base beyond just the 2 or 3 most recognized names. It adds another layer of legitimacy, another region of support, and another set of fighters along the border. A coalition built around only the biggest names would be easier for Tehran to dismiss as one faction's ambition. Kabat's inclusion makes it harder to frame this as anything other than a genuinely broad Kurdish movement. And the fifth is Kamala, which actually includes 2 related branches with a long history rooted in left-wing, secular Kurdish politics going back to the earliest days after the 1979 revolution. Kamala has paid an enormous price in this conflict already. On July 17, 2026, an Iranian missile and drone strike hit a Kamala camp near Erbil, killing 9 of its recruits and wounding several others. Just days later, on July 20th, Iran struck Kamala's headquarters again. Kamala itself has stated publicly that its bases have been targeted more than 40 times during this war. Think about that number for a second. 40 strikes against one political party's camps. That is not how you treat a minor nuisance. That is how you treat something you consider an existential threat. If you're finding this useful, do me a favor and share it with one person who has no idea any of this is happening, because this conflict deserves far more attention than it's getting. Now let's step back and understand why the terrain itself matters so much here. The Zagros Mountains are not just scenery in this story. They are one of the most important weapons either side has. These fighters grew up in these mountains. They know the ridgelines, the hidden paths, the valleys that don't appear clearly on any official map. Many of them fought in the war against ISIS and came home with real experience in drone warfare, coordinated strikes, and moving through hostile territory. The Revolutionary Guard's border units, by contrast, have spent years relying on fixed checkpoints, surveillance posts, and rapid reinforcement from nearby bases. When the American and Israeli air campaign began systematically destroying those very border posts, command centers, and communication hubs across the Kurdish provinces, it did something crucial. It didn't just weaken Iran's military in general, it specifically opened the exact corridors that Kurdish fighters would need to move through. Whether or not you believe every claim about how deep those fighters have pushed into Iranian territory, the pattern of destroyed border infrastructure is well documented, and it clearly benefits one side far more than the other. Now here comes the part of this story that shows just how frightened Tehran really is. Iran cannot fight a war on 2 major fronts at the same time and win both. It cannot absorb night after night of foreign airstrikes, while also containing a growing, coordinated Kurdish movement along its entire western border. So what does a cornered government do? It goes after the opposition wherever it can reach them, even outside its own borders. Since late February 2026, Iran has launched hundreds of attacks into the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq, specifically targeting Kurdish opposition bases. A large portion of those strikes hit Kurdish parties directly. Erbil has been struck. Smaller towns near the border have been struck. Energy companies operating in the region have had to suspend work because of the constant drone threats, with one major company halting operations in mid-July after a wave of drones targeted the area around Erbil in a single night. There have also been targeted killings. A Kurdish fighter was found dead in a hotel in Erbil in late June, and suspicion quickly fell on Iranian intelligence operatives. Whether or not every detail of that case is ever fully proven, the pattern fits a regime that has used assassination against Kurdish leaders for decades. This is a classic strategy from an old playbook. Strike the leadership before the coalition can fully organize. Keep the different groups separated so they can't reinforce each other. Hit the newest, most symbolic alliance hardest before it can turn coordination on paper into coordination on the battlefield. Now let's be completely honest with you, because you deserve the real picture, not just the exciting version. This coalition is real and it is active, but it is not yet a unified conventional army marching in formation toward Tehran. The 5, or in some counts 6 groups, still have different foreign relationships, different priorities, and different levels of trust with outside powers. PJAK's connection to the PKK makes Turkey deeply uncomfortable with any full-scale Kurdish military buildup near its own border. The relationship between these Kurdish forces and the United States has also been complicated. Earlier in the year, American officials publicly distanced themselves from deeper military involvement with Kurdish groups, even after signs of closer contact just weeks before. That kind of mixed signal is painfully familiar to anyone who has followed Kurdish history. Kurdish fighters supported the fight against ISIS shoulder to shoulder with American forces, only to feel abandoned when the political winds shifted. That memory does not fade quickly, and it shapes how carefully these leaders are moving now, even when their fighters are already engaged in real clashes on the ground. And clashes are happening right now, regardless of any official timeline anyone in Washington sets. Iranian security officers have been killed near border towns. Checkpoint attacks have been reported. KDPI fighters have died in ambushes deep enough inside Iranian territory that heavy weapons were needed to support the attack against them. This is not a quiet, dormant resistance waiting patiently for a green light from a foreign government. It is an active, ongoing, ground-level conflict happening in real villages, real mountain passes, and real border towns, even while Iran is simultaneously trying to survive one of the most sustained bombing campaigns it has faced in modern history. So what would success actually look like here? It's important to separate fantasy from reality. Nobody serious is describing a Kurdish army marching triumphantly into the streets of Tehran. That is not the realistic path. What is realistic, and what would matter enormously, is the creation of what analysts call liberated zones, areas inside Kurdish majority provinces where Iranian forces simply cannot safely operate anymore. Because every time they gather enough troops to retake the area, that gathering becomes an easy target from the air. A liberated town, a city where ordinary Kurdish civilians can organize, speak freely, and begin building the structures of self-governance without fear of a knock on the door in the middle of the night. That single image, one real Kurdish city functioning outside the regime's control, even briefly, would matter more than any battlefield statistic. It would send an unmistakable message to every other unhappy region inside Iran, from the Baloch communities in the southeast to Arab populations in the southwest to the many other Iranians simply exhausted by economic hardship and repression. It would say in the clearest possible terms that this regime is not as untouchable as it wants everyone to believe. History shows again and again that authoritarian governments rarely collapse because of military defeat alone. They collapse when enough people stop believing the government's claim to total control. Bombs can weaken the walls of a regime like this, but it's the people inside deciding they no longer accept those walls who actually bring them down. Before we get to how this story might end, let's take a moment to remember why any of this is happening at all, because it's easy to get lost in troop movements and forget the human cost underneath all of it. This war did not start in a vacuum. Kurdish communities inside Iran have lived for generations with the fear of arrest for something as simple as teaching in their own language or organizing a small community gathering. The 2022 death of a young Kurdish woman named Mahsa Amini while in police custody sparked massive nationwide protests that briefly brought the world's attention back to Iran's treatment of its own people. The world watched. The regime responded with executions. And then, as always happens, global attention moved on to the next headline. But this time is different because the pressure never fully went away. Protests continued in waves through 2025 and into 2026. Kurdish cities observed general strikes. Frustration kept building, even as the world's cameras looked elsewhere. And when the coalition finally formed in February, it wasn't some sudden burst of unity out of nowhere. It was the result of years of quiet coordination, shared grief, and a shared understanding that they were running out of time before the moment slipped away again. Even now, in the middle of everything, the regime has not slowed down its domestic repression for a single day. Reports throughout July describe continued arrests of activists, teachers, cultural figures, and ordinary Kurdish citizens. Executions of prisoners connected to earlier protest waves have continued. A young man in one Kurdish city was killed in an attack linked to regime-affiliated militia forces, and the resulting outrage sparked a general strike across the entire city, which was then met with even more heavy-handed policing. This is the pattern that has defined Tehran's relationship with its Kurdish population for nearly 5 decades. Suppress, punish, strike back, repeat. And it has worked for a very long time, because the Kurds never had all 3 of these things happening at once before. A truly unified coalition, a foreign air campaign simultaneously grinding down the regime's military capacity, and 5 separate armed movements finally operating under one shared command structure. All 3 of those conditions exist together right now for the first time in this long and painful history. Which brings us to the question that actually matters most. Not whether this coalition exists, because it clearly does. Not whether clashes are happening, because they clearly are. The real question is whether outside pressure on the regime continues long enough and consistently enough for these active border clashes to grow into something that looks more like genuine territorial control. And on the other side, the real question for Tehran is whether it can strike fast enough and hard enough at the coalition's leadership to break this alliance apart before it fully solidifies into a force it can no longer contain. One more thing worth understanding is why this particular front matters in a way that goes beyond military strategy. People often talk about economic pressure points when discussing Iran, oil exports, shipping lanes, that kind of leverage. Kurdistan represents something different. It's not about revenue, it's about legitimacy. Every night that Iranian state television has to explain away another missile strike on its own soil, every video that leaks out showing Kurdish resistance holding ground it wasn't supposed to be able to hold, chips away at the one thing every authoritarian government depends on more than weapons, the belief among its own population that resistance is pointless. The moment enough people stop believing that, the entire structure becomes far more fragile than any of its tanks or missiles would suggest. The fighters risking everything in these mountains right now are not doing it for headlines or attention. They are doing it for something much simpler and much older. The right to speak their own language without fear. The right to gather with neighbors without being reported to the authorities. The right to bury their dead without wondering if a drone will strike the funeral itself. Real families are losing real sons and daughters in these clashes, in these strikes on refugee camps, in these targeted killings across the border. Behind every statistic in this story is someone's name, someone's home, someone who grew up dreaming of a version of their homeland that looked nothing like the one they were born into. So here is where things stand as honestly as we can put it. The Kurdish coalition inside Iran is real, active, and growing more coordinated by the week. Tehran is frightened enough of it to strike across an international border, to target political headquarters directly, to face accusations of using banned weapons against opposition fighters. But it has not yet become the single deciding factor in this larger war, and anyone telling you with total certainty exactly how this ends is guessing, not reporting. What we do know is that a regime built on decades of fear is now facing pressure from every direction at once, from the sky above and from the mountains along its western edge. And for the first time in a very long time, the people who have been saying for nearly 50 years that this system could be challenged are finally being taken seriously by the rest of the world. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture than anything else you've seen on this topic, that's exactly why this channel exists. So make sure you're subscribed, because the next update from this front could come at any moment and you don't want to miss where this story goes next. What happens in these mountains over the coming weeks may end up mattering more than any single airstrike carried out from above. Bombs can crack a foundation, but foundations have survived bombing before. What breaks a government like this one is its own people finally deciding, together, in enough numbers and in enough places at once, that they no longer accept the walls built around them. 10 million Kurds have been waiting a very long time for someone to finally test whether those walls can fall. Right now, in the Zagros Mountains, that test is already underway, and the whole region is watching to see what happens next.